No one expected the procession to stop. The horses held position, cameras kept rolling, and the palace orchestra continued for several uneasy seconds until Princess Anne made a single quiet gesture. Witnesses later claimed she had seen something impossible. Queen Camilla wearing an heirloom never meant to leave the vault. What followed, according to palace watchers, became one of the most uncomfortable royal moments in years. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. State processions are built on precision. Every movement is rehearsed, every appearance reviewed, every detail measured against decadecim times century-soft royal expectation. That is why what happened next felt so unsettling to those who insist they noticed it in real time. There was no announcement, no obvious disturbance, no dramatic interruption. Only something stranger. Momentum itself seemed to disappear. According to various interpretations that later circulated among royal commentators and palace observers, Princess Anne's attention had fixed on something unexpected, long before anyone else realized there was a reason to look. Reports suggest she had maintained her usual composed presence throughout the opening moments of the event. But then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Those who follow royal protocol closely often describe Anne as someone who rarely reacts publicly. Decades of discipline, ceremony, and institutional loyalty have built her reputation as the family's quiet enforcer, the one who notices details others overlook and treats tradition less as preference and more as obligation. Which is why later speculation focused not on what she said, but on what she allegedly saw. Queen Camilla appeared composed, calm, entirely prepared for the occasion. Yet attention soon turned toward a particular piece she was wearing, an heirloom that, according to palace folklore and long-circulating interpretations of royal custom, occupied a complicated place inside the family collection. Not necessarily forbidden in any official public sense, but whispered about in terms usually reserved for objects carrying symbolic boundaries. Insiders and commentators would later describe the moment in dramatically different ways. Some suggested Anne recognized the significance immediately. Others claimed she simply noticed something unusual and requested clarification. No verified public account supports any confrontation, but in royal storytelling, silence often becomes louder than explanation. Then came the movement that triggered endless discussion. Aides began repositioning. Messages passed quietly between officials. Schedules appeared to stall. Observers later claimed small procedural adjustments started unfolding almost at once, subtle enough to escape most viewers, but unusual enough for experienced royal correspondents to take notice. The orchestra continued briefly. Personnel remained composed, yet the forward rhythm of the event no longer felt uninterrupted. The pause itself lasted only moments in public perception. But inside institutions built around certainty, moments become symbols. People watching from outside could not understand what had changed. Some assumed a security concern. Others thought a timing issue had emerged. A few immediately turned toward palace dynamics, convinced something internal had unfolded. Social media filled with slowed footage, comparisons, and theories. Commentators began revisiting older stories about ceremonial protocol and private family customs. And throughout it all, Camilla reportedly remained outwardly controlled. That detail only intensified speculation. Because if there had truly been concern over the heirloom, why no visible reaction? Why continue the appearance? Why not quietly adjust later? The absence of public acknowledgement created the exact kind of vacuum royal stories thrive inside. Within hours, unofficial explanations multiplied. Palace watchers revisited old discussions about inherited pieces, symbolic permissions, and unwritten boundaries that supposedly exist alongside formal rules. Some dismissed the entire episode as overanalysis. Others insisted something meaningful had happened beneath the surface. Yet one detail kept returning. Not the pause, not the whispers, not even Anne herself, the object. Because if observers were right, if the procession truly shifted because of a single heirloom, then the uncomfortable truth was no longer about ceremony at all. But the real question wasn't why Anne stopped the ceremony, it was why that heirloom mattered at all. Royal collections contain thousands of pieces. Yet insiders have long whispered that a handful were never treated as jewelry at all but as symbols of authority, memory, and unwritten rules. That was the thread people began pulling the moment questions emerged around the halted procession. Because among royal traditions, both documented and unofficial, there has always been a distinction between possession and permission. To the outside world, a royal heirloom appears to be a beautiful object inherited across generations. Inside palace mythology, however, certain pieces are often spoken about in entirely different terms. Not assets, not accessories, but markers, signals, silent declarations of continuity. And according to interpretations that rapidly surfaced after the event, the piece Queen Camilla was said to be wearing belonged to that rare category. No official public record describes any jewel as forbidden. That point matters. Yet royal observers have long argued that the monarchy operates through layers, formal rules written into protocol, and quieter customs preserved through habit, memory, and expectation. It is inside that second category where stories like this survive. Reports and long-standing commentary have suggested that certain heirlooms become attached to moments, rather than individuals. A coronation, a transition of generations, a private agreement, an understanding never publicly announced but deeply understood by those raised inside the institution. Over time, those traditions gain weight. Commentators who study royal history often point to how objects evolve into symbols of continuity. A necklace becomes associated with a queen's final years. A brooch becomes linked to mourning. A tiara appears only at carefully chosen occasions. Gradually, the item stops belonging to the wearer and begins belonging to the story. That is why speculation intensified so quickly. Because if the heirloom at the center of this moment carried even a fraction of the significance being discussed, then this was never about appearance. It was about timing, context, meaning. Some palace watchers argued there was likely nothing unusual at all, that permission had been granted privately, and observers were projecting drama onto ordinary protocol. Others proposed a more uncomfortable possibility, that there are internal expectations invisible to the public, and someone had crossed into symbolic territory without realizing how deeply those boundaries were felt. And then came the older stories. Whispers resurfaced about how previous generations allegedly handled pieces tied to succession and legacy. Accounts emerged claiming certain items were traditionally associated with specific branches of the family, or reserved for moments carrying constitutional symbolism. None of these interpretations could be confirmed publicly, yet they spread because they sounded believable inside a monarchy built on ritual. Princess Anne's name returned to the center of those discussions, not because she had authority over jewels, but because observers often portray her as someone who treats ceremonial continuity with unusual seriousness. If she truly reacted, people wondered. Perhaps she wasn't reacting to an object at all. Perhaps she was reacting to what wearing it implied. That possibility transformed the entire story. Suddenly, the halted procession no longer looked like a scheduling anomaly. It became, at least in public imagination, a question of legacy. Who protects tradition? Who interprets it? And who decides when an old rule still matters? Because if royal history teaches anything, it is that objects rarely become controversial on their own. Someone gives them meaning. Someone preserves that meaning. And sometimes someone challenges it. If those traditions were real, then someone had approved the impossible or ignored the rules entirely. Palace schedules are planned with military precision. Interruptions almost never happen unless someone believes the institution itself is at risk. That was the idea that began taking hold almost immediately after discussion shifted from the heirloom itself to the unexplained pause surrounding it. Because royal events do not drift off course by accident. They are timed, layered, approved, reviewed, and protected through procedures designed specifically to prevent uncertainty from becoming public. Which meant that if something had changed in the middle of the procession, as observers claimed, then the real story may not have been visible at all. According to interpretations that circulated afterward, the interruption did not arrive as a dramatic command. It arrived the way institutional decisions often do. Quietly, indirectly, and without explanation. Accounts from royal commentators described an unusual pattern of movement among staff and aides. Messages appearing where there had been none moments before. Officials adjusting positions. Vehicles slowing. Conversations shortening. None of these details were confirmed publicly, but together they created a feeling that something administrative, not ceremonial, had briefly taken over. And inside institutions built on continuity, administrative moments are often the most revealing. What fascinated observers was not that people moved quickly, it was that no one appeared confused. That detail became central to the speculation. Because confusion suggests surprise. Coordination suggests recognition. Some interpreted the halt as evidence that senior officials had already understood the sensitivity surrounding the heirloom and acted immediately once attention was drawn to it. Others argued the opposite, that aides themselves may have been trying to determine whether any protocol issue existed at all. In that version of events, the pause wasn't enforcement, it was uncertainty. Then another question emerged. Who had approved the appearance in the first place? If the heirloom carried no restrictions, then nothing unusual had happened, and the discussion ended there. But if palace customs existed around symbolic uses, some commentators insisted approval itself suddenly became part of the mystery. People began constructing competing explanations. One theory suggested full authorization had always existed, and observers misunderstood internal tradition. Another suggested authorization had been assumed rather than formally clarified. A third, and easily the most dramatic, imagined that different parts of the institution interpreted the same customs differently, creating a quiet collision between modernization and preservation. That possibility placed Princess Anne back at the center, not because anyone claimed she controlled ceremonial access, but because of what she has come to represent in public imagination. Over decades, Anne has earned a reputation, fairly or unfairly, as the royal most associated with discipline, continuity, and institutional memory. The figure who notices details others dismiss. The one observers imagine stepping forward when symbolism begins drifting into ambiguity. As that narrative spread, her alleged gesture during the procession transformed in meaning. It was no longer interpreted as personal disapproval. It became something larger. To some, it represented a guardian protecting invisible boundaries. To others, it represented an outdated system struggling to define itself. The palace, meanwhile, said nothing. No clarification, no correction, no effort to address the speculation directly. And silence inside royal life rarely removes curiosity. It feeds it, because once people begin believing they have witnessed a disagreement that was never meant to become visible, every pause starts looking intentional, every adjustment starts looking strategic, and every unanswered question becomes evidence of something bigger waiting underneath. Yet the stoppage was only the visible part of a much older disagreement. Royal conflict rarely arrives as shouting. More often, it arrives through schedules, permissions, seating plans, and objects. By the time that idea began circulating publicly, the discussion had already moved far beyond whether a procession had paused or whether a particular heirloom had appeared unexpectedly. The conversation had become something more sensitive, and in many ways more familiar to anyone who studies institutions built on continuity. Not a dispute between people, but a disagreement between philosophies. Because beneath nearly every modern royal controversy sits the same quiet question. What survives and what changes? For years, different interpretations of the monarchy have existed side by side. One view sees survival through adaptation. The institution evolves, traditions soften, symbolism becomes more flexible, and relevance comes through modern connection. Another view believes survival depends on limits, that continuity only survives when boundaries remain visible, even when they seem outdated to everyone else. Neither philosophy openly declares war, but occasionally they collide. That possibility became the hidden current beneath the entire heirloom discussion. Commentators who revisited the moment increasingly framed Princess Anne not as a person reacting emotionally, but as someone embodying an older institutional instinct. In public perception, she has long represented the idea that monarchy only works when personal preference comes second to inherited responsibility. The role is larger than the individual. Ceremony matters because symbolism matters. And symbolism matters because people must believe the institution still knows what it stands for. From that perspective, even small choices carry enormous weight. A title granted too casually, a tradition adjusted too quickly, an object appearing at the wrong moment. Each one becomes larger than itself. At the same time, observers who interpreted events differently suggested something equally understandable. They argued that monarchy cannot remain frozen forever, that customs evolve, that expectations shift, that people inside the institution inevitably reinterpret old rules through present realities. Within those interpretations, Queen Camilla often appeared less as a challenger and more as someone operating from a different set of priorities. Not rejection of tradition, but a different reading of it. Supporters of that view suggested ceremonial decisions are increasingly shaped by practicality, accessibility, and contemporary expectations, rather than preserving invisible distinctions the public may never fully understand. And that is where tension quietly sharpened. Because if one side sees adaptation as survival, while the other sees adaptation as erosion, then the exact same action can carry completely opposite meanings. What one person experiences as modernization, another experiences as loss. Suddenly, the discussion around the heirloom stopped being about ownership or protocol. It became symbolic territory. If the appearance had been intentional, some interpreted it as confidence in a changing institution. If it had not been carefully considered, others interpreted it as proof that old boundaries were becoming harder to define. Neither explanation required confrontation. That is what made the story feel so compelling. No raised voices. No official disagreement. Only silence. And inside silence, people began assigning meaning. The halted procession became a metaphor. The heirloom became a question. Princess Anne became, in public imagination, a guardian of continuity. Queen Camilla became a symbol fairly or unfairly of a monarchy trying to negotiate its future. Not enemies, not rivals, just representatives of different instincts inside the same institution. But once people started viewing the moment through that lens, a new question appeared almost immediately. If this truly reflected a deeper divide, then someone eventually would have to respond. Then attention shifted from the procession itself to who might step in next. The palace didn't deny anything immediately, and that silence became the story. At first, the absence of an explanation looked ordinary. Royal households rarely respond to every rumor, every theory, every moment pulled apart by commentators looking for meaning. Silence has always been one of the institution's oldest tools. It preserves dignity. It avoids escalation. It allows attention to move elsewhere. But this time, attention did not move. Instead, it concentrated. Within hours, discussions surrounding the procession had expanded beyond the people directly involved and turned into something larger, stranger, and more difficult to contain. The original question whether Princess Anne had reacted to a ceremonial issue started breaking into dozens of smaller questions. Why had there been a pause? Why had schedules appeared to shift? Why had no clarification come afterward? And most importantly, if nothing unusual had happened, why did so many people feel as though something had? That uncertainty created space. And in royal life, empty space rarely stays empty. Commentators, columnists, and longtime royal observers began offering sharply different interpretations. Some urged caution and argued the entire discussion reflected public fascination with symbolism rather than any meaningful disagreement. According to that view, people had transformed an ordinary procedural moment into a dramatic narrative, because monarchy itself encourages interpretation. Others were less dismissive. Anonymous commentary attributed to palace circles impossible to verify and impossible to ignore began appearing in fragments. References to tradition, suggestions of internal consultation, vague remarks about ceremonial expectations. Nothing direct. Nothing substantial, yet enough to convince audiences that conversations might have happened somewhere behind closed doors. That was all the public needed. Online discussions accelerated immediately. One theory claimed the procession pause had been entirely unrelated, and the heirloom story emerged afterward through coincidence. Another insisted the issue had never been the object itself but the symbolism attached to its appearance. Others became even more ambitious, suggesting the moment reflected a broader struggle over identity inside a changing monarchy. The more theories appeared, the more one thing became clear. People were no longer debating jewelry. They were debating authority. Who defines meaning inside a royal institution? Who decides when tradition evolves? Who has the power to interpret unwritten rules? Those questions carried emotional weight because they touched something deeper than ceremony. They touched legitimacy, not legal legitimacy, but symbolic legitimacy. The public understanding that institutions survive because people believe someone is still protecting their boundaries. Officials, meanwhile, maintained restraint. Requests for detailed explanation reportedly produced no major clarification. No public correction. No dramatic rejection of speculation. Just continued movement forward. That silence had consequences. Because when institutions refuse to explain themselves, audiences begin writing explanations of their own. And slowly, the narrative shifted again. Princess Anne stopped being discussed as an individual and became associated with preservation. Queen Camilla stopped being discussed as a participant and became associated with change. The heirloom stopped being discussed as an object and became associated with permission. Every silence added meaning. Every unanswered question created more. By now, expectations had changed completely. People no longer wanted confirmation of what happened during the procession. They wanted to know whether someone would eventually define what the moment meant. Because if no explanation arrived, then interpretation itself would become the official story. And what emerged from that process would prove far more powerful than the original rumor ever was. But what emerged next had less to do with jewelry and more to do with control. In royal life, ownership and permission are rarely the same thing. That realization began changing the way people interpreted everything that had happened before. The halted procession no longer looked like an isolated interruption. The unanswered questions no longer felt accidental. Even the discussions about symbolism started moving towards something deeper and far more difficult to explain in public. The distinction between holding something and representing something. Because inside institutions shaped by history, those two ideas are rarely treated as equal. Public imagination often assumes royal collections function like inheritance in ordinary life. A piece exists, someone receives access to it, and the story ends there. But traditions surrounding monarchy have always carried a more complicated emotional logic. Certain objects become linked to roles, moments, expectations, and identities that outlive individual people. That distinction matters. Not because of legal ownership, not because of written authority, but because symbols survive differently than possessions do. According to interpretations often discussed by royal observers, ceremonial traditions sometimes operate less like property systems and more like stewardship. The object is not viewed as belonging entirely to the person wearing it. Instead, the wearer becomes a temporary guardian of meaning attached long before they arrived and long after they leave. Whether that interpretation reflects reality or simply public mythology almost stopped mattering. People believed in it. And belief is what gives institutions their power. That was why conversations surrounding the heirloom continued expanding. If an object carries symbolic stewardship, then appearing with it can communicate things no statement ever says directly. Continuity, recognition, transition, endorsement, or, in moments of uncertainty, something people interpret as challenge. Small decisions become large messages, because institutions teach people to look for messages. That pressure creates its own quiet burden. Every appearance becomes read for intention. Every absence becomes analyzed. Every adjustment becomes meaningful. And once those expectations exist, No one inside the institution gets complete control over interpretation anymore. That emotional reality gave the earlier silence a different feeling. Perhaps there had been no disagreement at all. Perhaps there had only been awareness that explaining symbolic decisions publicly often creates more problems than leaving them unresolved. But another possibility lingered beneath the surface. What if people weren't reacting to the heirloom? What if they were reacting to what they thought the heirloom represented? Because by now the discussion had moved into territory far larger than ceremony. Questions emerged about image. Questions emerged about authority. Questions emerged about succession not in the constitutional sense, but in the emotional sense. Who embodies continuity? Who shapes the public understanding of what the monarchy becomes next? Who gets interpreted as preserving meaning, and who gets interpreted as redefining it? Those are dangerous questions for institutions, because they rarely produce clean answers. And suddenly the emotional stakes felt heavier. A paused procession had become a conversation about identity. A single object had become a conversation about stewardship. Silence had become a conversation about power. People who once dismissed the moment as ordinary now found themselves debating whether royal customs should remain untouched or evolve openly. Others wondered whether those categories had ever truly existed at all, because perhaps the real tension was not between tradition and change. Perhaps it was between who gets to decide what each of those words means. And once that question entered the story, the procession itself almost disappeared. By now, the halted procession had become something much larger. No dramatic announcement followed. No confrontation was televised. Yet observers insisted something had changed. That was the strange part. After days of speculation, competing interpretations, and endless attempts to decode a moment nobody officially explained, the monarchy did what it has done through generations of uncertainty. It continued. No public correction arrived to settle the debate. No ceremonial statement appeared to redefine expectations. No visible disagreement surfaced to confirm that anything unusual had happened at all. And yet, for many watching closely, the atmosphere felt different. Not dramatically different, subtly different. That distinction mattered, because institutions rarely announce recalibration while it is happening. Instead, they absorb attention quietly and move forward as though nothing ever required adjustment. In the weeks that followed, observers began assigning meaning to details that might otherwise have passed unnoticed. Public appearances were discussed differently. Ceremonial choices received more attention than before. Timing, positioning, emphasis, things once dismissed as routine became subjects of interpretation. Not because anyone had confirmed a shift, but because once people believe they have seen the edges of an institution exposed, they start looking for signs everywhere. Some insisted they noticed a greater sense of caution. Others argued there was simply greater awareness from audiences projecting significance onto normal royal operations. Either way, the conversation slowly changed. The earlier urgency began to cool. Theories that once sounded explosive became more restrained. Questions became more reflective. People stopped asking whether someone had broken a rule and started asking whether the rule had ever existed in the way they imagined. That shift lowered the temperature, but deepened the story. Because attention turned away from conflict and toward something quieter. Continuity. Observers returned to an old truth about monarchy. Institutions survive not by winning every argument, but by refusing to become defined by them. Whatever people believed had happened during the procession, the institution itself appeared unwilling to validate the drama surrounding it. Events continued. Appearances continued. Schedules continued. That continuation became meaningful in its own way. To some, it suggested confidence. To others, discipline. To others still, a deliberate reminder that monarchy is designed to outlast moments of interpretation. At the center of all of this remained the same unresolved tension. Modern expectations ask institutions to explain themselves. Older traditions often expect institutions to endure without explanation. Perhaps that was the adjustment people thought they sensed, not stricter rules, not hidden consequences, but renewed awareness of that balance. Public life requires visibility, Royal life still depends on mystery. And maybe that is why the silence never fully disappeared. Because explanations satisfy curiosity, but ambiguity protects symbolism. Over time, the conversation surrounding the heirloom began losing urgency. New events arrived. Attention moved. Commentary softened. Yet something remained. Not certainty. Not proof. Just a lingering feeling that a small ceremonial interruption had briefly revealed how much invisible structure exists beneath moments people usually treat as routine. No speeches followed. No declarations were made. No one stood forward to define what should be remembered. And perhaps that was the point. The monarchy did not answer the question. It simply continued, leaving everyone else to decide what the silence meant. And in the end, the most powerful statement may have been the one never spoken. Long after the cameras turned away, people remembered only one image, a royal procession frozen in motion. Not because anyone could prove what caused it. Not because a statement was released. Not because history recorded it as a turning point. But because moments like that have a way of surviving long after details disappear. Weeks after the discussion had cooled and attention moved elsewhere, people were still returning to the same question. Not what happened. Not who approved what. Not whether a tradition had been protected or misunderstood. But why that brief interruption felt important at all. Perhaps because royal life has always existed in a strange space between reality and meaning. Ceremonies happen in public, yet their significance often depends on things the public cannot fully see. Protocol appears orderly, but much of its emotional weight comes from continuity, memory, and interpretation. People do not only watch institutions, they assign stories to them. And this story became bigger than anyone expected. Because once people believed they had witnessed a moment where movement paused and symbolism took over, they started seeing the monarchy differently. Not weaker, not stronger, just more human. An institution that projects certainty but still carries invisible tensions beneath the surface. That realization lingered. The halted procession became less about a supposed disagreement and more about an old question every institution eventually faces. What deserves protection? And what deserves reinvention? For some, the answer was obvious. Tradition survives because someone insists it matters. For others, tradition survives because someone allows it to evolve. Neither side could prove their interpretation. And maybe that was always the point. Because this story was never truly about determining who was right. It was about understanding why people cared so deeply. The heirloom itself faded back into uncertainty. The speculations softened. The competing narratives lost urgency, yet the emotional imprint remained. People remembered Princess Anne not because she spoke. People remembered Queen Camilla not because she responded. People remembered a pause. That pause became a symbol people could project on autonomy, authority, continuity, change, protection, adaptation. Each person saw something different. That is what makes institutions powerful. And fragile. They survive because millions of people agree to believe in meanings larger than individual moments. But meanings are never fixed forever. They must be carried, interpreted, protected, questioned, then carried again. And perhaps that is why no definitive answer ever arrived. Because certainty closes stories, mystery preserves them. So the procession continued. The schedules resumed. The conversations slowly disappeared. Yet somewhere in public memory, that brief interruption remains suspended not as evidence, not as proof, but as a reminder that institutions are often revealed not in their grand declarations but in their smallest hesitations. No official account may ever explain what people thought they saw. No archive may record the emotion attached to that moment. But perhaps legacy was never about recording certainty. Perhaps legacy has always been about what people choose to remember. Sometimes the most powerful royal moments are not the speeches that are delivered, but the ceremonies that briefly stop. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.